This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by the Natural Gas Supply Association. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on natural gas issues, we're going to talk with Robbie Fraser, Associate Director of Global Research and Analytics for the Schneider Electric Sustainability Business. Robbie's going to describe the latest natural gas supply-demand dynamics and how they're impacting energy market prices. Robbie's been with Schneider Electric for over a decade. He became the Associate Director of Global Research and Analytics after over 5 years as a Schneider commodity analyst. His expertise has been recognized by the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, and Bloomberg, and he leads teams covering 75 energy commodity markets. So, Robbie, how would you describe today's natural gas market supply-demand dynamics? There's a lot of factors hitting here.
So
Tell
they're
us a little
absolutely. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to step over you there.
bit. I was no, it's okay. I get stepped over all the time, but I was gonna just elaborate a little bit on that question because I wanted to just mention some of the factors and how they're impacting the dynamics. Those energy markets right now are reacting to all kinds of things, most significantly the recent budget bill, but also LNG exports, pipeline constraints, things that you know about that I don't. So, but go on now. Let's get into it. Supply demand dynamics.
Supply demand dynamics. So for natural gas, a little bit of a crossroads right now today.
Right.
So you've got a bit of a different picture as far as where have we been and where are we going here for natural gas. And so if I look at the market today, I pull up all my charts and fundamentals and the different things I'm looking at. I see a market that is relatively well supplied. For natural gas, those in the industry, we're always looking at storage. How much natural gas is in storage? What kind of buffer do I have for all those kind of winter shocks and summer heat waves and all those things that are coming? And storage right now is actually above average. We've got relatively strong storage levels, and that's at least helped keep somewhat of a lid on prices. But where we're going is a much tighter market, one that carries more risk than I think that might imply. So we look at some trends like natural gas production at a crossroads of its own, because on the one hand, I can tell you that U.S. gas production right now is close to all-time highs. And if the U.S. is close to all-time highs, that means we're close to all-time highs globally, producing more natural gas than any country in the world. But I could also tell you that really hasn't grown throughout 2025. There hasn't been much to speak of at all in terms of natural gas production growth. That has been pretty stale. At the same time, we know we've got a lot of demand growth ahead for reasons that I know you, many of the listeners will be familiar with, but whether that's what we see on the data center side, what that's bringing to power generation demand. For natural gas, the biggest one is liquefied natural gas, those LNG exports. That, not just talking long term, but even kind of next few months, just this winter, next year, that is bringing a wave of demand to the natural gas market. And so when you couple together a lot of demand growth and not a lot of supply growth, you don't necessarily have to be a master economist to see this is going to bring some pressures, to the market that it's going to have to grapple with going forward here.
Wow. And where is that? Are those LNG exports going? Do you have a picture? I mean, I've mentioned several times on the podcast how important those LNG exports have been for Europe because of the Ukraine conflict. Is that still the focus, or I've heard that other countries are in competition for those exports?
So both are true. Now, Europe still is the primary destination market for that U.S. LNG. Even if we kind of set aside even the political backdrop, the economics are there just in the sense that when we talk about U.S. LNG exports, these are basically plants going out from the Gulf there, Texas coast, Louisiana coast. This is where the bulk of that capacity is concentrated. And so going to Europe is, of course, just a shorter transit compared to East Asia, even though East Asia is still where your highest LNG demand countries are, South Korea, China, Japan, others. But you also don't have to pay Panama Canal tolls. It just makes a lot more sense when you can to ship it to the European market. So that's been the primary destination market, but it's created some interesting dynamics globally. We're talking to global clients and looking at it through a global lens. If I looked at the commodity price of natural gas in Europe and I look at the commodity price in East Asia, the correlation is extremely strong. And not just, they generally are kind of go up and down over, several months. At a day-to-day, hour-by-hour level, they're strong. And that is a direct byproduct of competing for those LNG cargoes. So if those East Asian buyers, if they're offering a few extra dollars per MMBTU, that can flip the economic case, and you may get some of those spot cargoes moving to Europe. Flip side is Qatari cargoes. You might see those that typically go to Asia. If Europe, sees conditions that are really driving up demand, offers, a little bit higher, prices get higher there, those cargoes can divert a bit. So there's some flexibility in the market that is causing some convergence, more so among those markets really taking in LNG, but driving an interesting dynamic in that sense.
Overall, the message is demand, though. Demand, demand, demand. If I hear you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one more point I want to ask about pipeline constraints. Is that affecting the market significantly, or is that sort of set aside, separate question?
It's always a piece, that comes into play. When we look at the U.S., we're talking about shale boom, and shale booms are not always happening where demand centers are necessarily located. And so the logistical challenge is, for that sector, they want to bring those two together. What we're seeing right now, and when we talk about pipeline challenges these days, a lot of times we're focused on what is going to connect, shale natural gas to these additional LNG facilities that we're bringing online. I can think back to when I started in my role with Schneider 10 years ago, our LNG exports were essentially zero. Really quickly, we're ramping up to 20% of our total production capacity being able to be exported. So that's a lot of change in a relatively short period of time. And so when we look at pipelines that have to be built, I mentioned it's Texas, Louisiana coast. That's also production centers as well, not coincidentally. But we see the Permian, the Eagle Ford shale basins in Texas. We see the Haynesville shale basin there that's concentrated largely in Louisiana. That's where the pipeline capacity, those in the industry would probably say is most needed. Texas has been an example at times in the past where they've probably had far fewer hurdles as far as moving pipelines to completion, because if you're not crossing state boundaries, of course, you don't have quite the FERC oversight, some of the other pieces, those steps become much quicker, but they're going to need a lot of capacity to be able to connect that to make those LNG economics work. Right now, if we look at Haynesville, Permian in particular, those projects seem to be moving forward in those cases.
This episode is brought to you by the Natural Gas Supply Association, a DC-based trade association that represents domestic producers and marketers of natural gas. Natural gas stands out as a fuel of choice for America's energy future. It is affordable, reliable, and sustainable. Today, natural gas powers a growing share of industrial facilities, data centers, homes, and also supports the expansion of renewable energy. The benefits of natural gas rely not only on expanding our nation's energy infrastructure, like pipelines and storage facilities, but also ensuring regulatory certainty so businesses can construct and maintain this infrastructure. The Natural Gas Supply Association advocates for permitting reform to streamline the process for approving necessary infrastructure projects without compromising environmental protections. The natural gas sector has proven itself adaptable and resilient, meeting rising demand while maintaining affordability. By investing in infrastructure, embracing permitting reform, and fostering a fact-based regulatory environment, we can ensure that natural gas continues to be a reliable foundation for America's energy future. It is our responsibility to strengthen this foundation today so that we can meet the energy demands of tomorrow. Learn more by visiting www.ngsa.org.
Yeah. that brings us basically to the next topic I want to discuss with you, Robbie, and that's permitting. There's been a lot of interest in reforms for permitting of natural gas plants and natural gas pipelines. So my question is, if you're in the market, you're going to be looking ahead what's coming. And my question to you is, do you see reforms for permitting coming? Do you know what kinds of reforms do you think will be coming? And how will those reforms and or if I may say it that way, another failure to impose reforms like what happened with the Manchin-Barrasso bill last year, how is all that going to impact energy markets?
Yeah, and it's a question that I think we'll be talking about for a while. It's probably, I think, a good example in a lot of ways that while in so many ways between, administrations, presidential administrations, we see what looks like almost kind of binary shifts in terms of energy policy, how they approach, energy policy in general. That doesn't always mean that the reality on the ground, the permitting reality in these is quite as binary as the policy, at the executive level. Natural gas pipelines, I think, are a fair example of that, where even though you've had clear shifts at the federal level, state challenges are a big piece a lot of times.
I'm hearing that everywhere. That's very true.
So, and it becomes kind of cost benefit analysis and all these different things that companies in those industries are looking at. But I think the important thing, the way we look at it, where we're just interested in, what ultimately becomes of the market, what does that do to supply and demand, and what does that situation look like? Challenges are going to persist, and it's going to continually probably try to clear those roadblocks in different ways in markets like Texas, Louisiana, that are generally have a history of being friendlier to oil and gas infrastructure and those type of things. I don't see a scenario where suddenly markets in the Northeast that have a lot more regulatory barriers to pipelines, that those suddenly get cleared and those kind of eagerly move forward. I think the challenges that we've seen are going to persist moving forward.
Interesting. Yeah, I've been preparing a series on permitting reforms for the podcast, and I've talked to a lot of people, and the impression I get is that the podcast series is going to be more about state and local reforms than federal action. But that's a topic for another day. The next question I want to ask you, Robbie, goes back to what you said about the crossroads, but in maybe a little different way. The last administration was leading an energy transition that was big on wind, solar, and batteries, but it had funding for pilots and demonstrations for carbon capture, enhanced geothermal, advanced nuclear, hydrogen hubs, and it included supports for customer-owned resources too. The current administration seems to be narrowing the focus pretty dramatically. And what I'm asking you is, how has that impacted energy markets? Of course, it's only been a short while. This administration has only been in place for a few months. But where do you see all this going? What further impacts do you see coming?
Yeah, like so many things, particularly in energy markets, when you look at crude, natural gas, electric power is so different in so many ways compared to how we look at other markets. But one thing that is common in the electric power space is a lot of the big changes you see aren't necessarily going to show up this year, next year, or the next few years. A lot of times you're talking about decisions made now that really start to show up on a 5, 10, 15-year timeline. And I think this is probably a good example where you've got a lot of these technologies that, their type of technology show a lot of promise, but infancy stages or earlier stages, certainly when we're looking at overall supply and demand, if we're looking at what's the potential impact to the commodity price of electric power, these technologies today, they don't have a big role in the generation mix necessarily. Now, the real question is, how big of a role could they have in the generation mix in 2030 and 2040? Anybody's going to be hard pressed, I think, to be able to answer that. And R&D and those kind of things are the ones that are going to drive you a little bit closer. As far as how that's playing out right now, though, for those looking at market prices and how is that hitting the market today, it largely isn't yet, because we're still looking at a grid that, from a price standpoint, is dominated by Natural gas to a large extent, depending on your markets, wind and solar certainly having a huge amount of influence as well. But those are kind of what we look at as our price setters. And so those others, long-term implications, they're not rattling today's market.
Well, that leads me to my last question. This is a tough one. I'm actually not asking you to get out your crystal ball for this last question, Robbie. What I'm asking you is what trends you are now seeing. What do you see that's happening now that's trend setting? An example might be the shortage of natural gas power plant deliveries, the delays and the delays in the supply chain. But what trends are you seeing that are going to affect the natural gas sector and other energy markets around the world? And finally, how are those trends going to impact U.S. Energy markets?
For sure. And it almost kind of circles back to some of what we talked about at the start, talking about a crossroads for natural gas, and especially when we think about natural gas in relation to power markets, to its role in terms of power generation. Of course, as it stands still today, natural gas, the largest single source of power generation in the US and across most markets globally, certainly many markets. But we've gone through this extended stretch now where natural gas has really primarily benefited from coal retirements. Cheaper natural gas has outcompeted coal. It's generally forced coal increasingly off the grid, off the generation mix. And so natural gas has grown. At the same time, wind and solar have grown. They've grown faster in most cases, but they've kind of grown alongside each other. But the more that you kind of kick coal off the generation mix, the more I think we see some of that direct competition even between natural gas and wind and solar, just as far as being that marginal fuel source in what kind of capacity factor they're bringing to the market. I think you see this playing out in some cases in the production space. I mentioned price. I mentioned production has kind of stalled for U.S. natural gas this year.
Yeah.
Prices by historical standards, we would say, look reasonably favorable for natural gas producers, but they haven't necessarily turned on the taps. And there's a few things kind of happening in the background that I think is driving that. You've got some capital discipline among producers. They're more debt averse. They see these energy transitions occurring, and I think they're asking the hard questions about what is our future in this market. You've also got, things that, U.S. natural gas in particular is so intertwined with global oil markets because so much of U.S. natural gas is we call it associated gas. It's pretty much produced as a byproduct of oil production, and U.S. oil also close to all-time highs, producing more than any country in the world right now, also stalling, maybe even in a bigger way. Rig counts are down for U.S. oil, and that's because it's at a real period of change. OPEC or OPEC Plus, kind of this coalition of countries, they've been cutting production the past few years, and the U.S. has taken advantage of that. USSC's market share by producing more oil, that's pivoted. So starting back in April, OPEC Plus is bringing more oil back to the market. They're boosting supply, more than 2 million barrels a day in a 6-month span. That's more than 2% of global supply. And from a U.S. standpoint, from a power market standpoint, that might feel kind of disconnected, but that means that U.S. oil production is not growing. That's a big reason gas production isn't growing. And that's why we're not seeing as much responsiveness, from the gas side, even if you would say, hey, prices are higher than what we saw last year. How come producers aren't taking advantage? Well, there's a lot of dynamics, but oil is also a piece of that as well.
Interesting. Let me just elaborate on that question just a little bit more before we close it out, Robbie. Are you seeing any indication at all that the uncertainty that's permeating everything in the marketplace, do you see it letting up? Is there any sense that maybe we'll reach a place where producers and transporters will have some sort of sense of where we're really going?
I don't know if it would really feel like the energy market if all that kind of cleared up. It's uncertainty seems to be one of the more certain things, but we'll solve today's challenges in due time. But I'd say the one thing I'm confident in is new challenges will pop up over that time that we're solving them. But that's, the best you can do at the end of the day is take it in, understand where you can find some degree of certainty, and make an anchor there, and also understand where there's uncertainty, where you need to mitigate risk, where you need to accept that uncertainty lies. And it's the hallmarks of the energy market and risk management and all those kind of things that go into it. But I would expect uncertainty to be a characteristic we're using to talk about energy markets for some time to come.
Yeah, there's an old saying, get used to change because it's the only thing that doesn't change. We're going to leave it there. Robbie Fraser, Schneider Electric Sustainability Business Associate Director of Global Research and Analytics, has told us about market factors and trends in U.S. and global natural gas and energy markets at a crossroads. Thank you so much for this wonderful explication, Robbie. It's been great talking to you. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Natural Gas Supply Association. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.